Greetings to you all, from all corners of Zimbabwe, the region, the diaspora, and a special welcome to our panelists, whom I will introduce shortly. Today we're looking at the subject of xenophobia or Afrophobia, as it appears to be more accurately, in South Africa. The tragic death of Elvis Nyati on the 6th of April, interrogating the roots of Afrophobia in South Africa and examining why poor Zimbabwean migrants in particular appear to be the main targets. As the concept note reads, and quoting a tweet which drew my attention, crime does not have a nationality. You do not become a criminal because you are European or Zimbabwean. No one should ever say one is guilty because of being from Zimbabwe. The way we have come to hate Zimbabweans, where do we come from as a nation to hate other Black people this way? This was said to be the former Chief Justice of South Africa, Mogoeng Mogoeng. But I think it summarizes the topic before us. And we have experts, the few people who have written on this matter, people who have been on the cutting edge of previous xenophobic or Afrophobic outbursts in South Africa. We don't intend to indulge in emotional debate on this subject. Our purpose as scholars, as activists, as thought leaders is to help educate our people across the continent. And I was glad to come across a report done by South African scholars entitled Scholars Weigh In on the Migrant Question. It was done by the South African Social Attitudes Survey and the Human Science Research Council, of which I'm honored to be a member of the board. The report is very interesting. It begins by saying the general public appear to be misinformed about the impact of migration and how it affects the national labor market. Many of the main misconceptions are anchored in an overestimation of the number of foreign-born nationals in the country, end of quote. And I think this is important because it helps to answer some of the very angry, and a lot of anger out there. As I can quote the Minister of Home Affairs of South Africa, was a lady the other day. I quote, "I am coming for them. When all of them are in jail, locked in, and the keys have been thrown away, then I'll step down, only then." And someone commented, a Zimbabwean, so he wants them dead or to rot in jail. As I said earlier, we don't want to indulge in polemics and mudslinging. I think the point has been made by the scholars I've referred to, that much of the debate in South Africa on migrants is based on not enough information. And Stephen Gordon of the Human Science Research Council on April 14th notes, among other elements, the number of migrants or foreign-born nationals in 2019 in South Africa was 4.2 million, or 7.2% of the population of more than 60 million in South Africa, and not the tens of millions as being bandied around in South Africa media. He adds, there's no evidence that international migrants are a major cause of unemployment in South Africa. The 2018 World Bank report states that for every employed migrant in South Africa, 2 jobs were created for South Africans. However, most migrants are vulnerable, and the participation of figures in the labor market in South Africa is average of 10 to 12% per sector. Migrants, 10 to 12%. Most are in the construction and engineering field, 12% as per 2017. Restaurants, bars, canteens, shebeens, 10.6%. Hotels, camping, etc., 7.2%. And agriculture, farming generally, 11.7%. So the scholars conclude, it is imperative that the country develops policies to tackle the challenges based on sound evidence, and that they are implemented from this perspective. I think that is the purpose of our discussion today, to try and shed light on this problem and to help resolve it. So we have here Chipo Dendere, a young Zimbabwean scholar, professor at Wellesley College in the US, but a regular commentator on home affairs in Zimbabwe. And amazing for a person that far away, the amount of information she has at her fingertips. And it was her tweet soon after Nyati's death that attracted attention and led to this title for this evening. Welcome, Chipo. Then we have Dale McKinley from the Copenhagen Africa Against Xenophobia. And again, we'll ask Dale to introduce Copenhagen briefly. While Chipo will look at the question of why are poor Zimbabwean migrants in particular appear to be the main targets, Dale will try and explain to us the causes of Afrophobia in South Africa. Last but not least, we have Eleanor Sisulu, who has kindly stepped in for Namboniso, who apologizes due to ESCOM problems and lack of a backup for this evening. Namboniso has been on this platform before, and we hope that with luck she can get some power and join us subsequently. But Eleanor Sisulu is a regular on this platform. She's a Zimbabwean South African, and as I was boast, my niece as well. So that Eleanor has been involved in the many discussions on the subject, and I remember a passionate and emotional outbursts in following previous xenophobic and Afrophobic attacks in South Africa. She has been on the cutting edge, as I said earlier, and is a regular commentator on these issues in South Africa. So on that note, I invite Chipo to open the discussion for us.
Thank you, Professor Ibo. And my sincere apologies to everyone. My voice sounds terrible. I have the worst cough that I've ever experienced, but I'll do my best to be here and present. So I thought about how to first have this discussion. A lot of our academic work over the last, I think, 2 decades has focused a lot on migration into South Africa. And there has been somewhat of a bias, I think, of just thinking about documented migrants, of thinking about educated migrants. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. But I think over the years, we've also missed an opportunity to study what's happening with what the International Organization of Migration terms day-to-day migrants. But I'll take us back to the 1920s and the 1930s, which is when we have early records of proper migration within the region, and particularly in South Africa because of the mining industry. At that point, as many of you already know, there was need for day workers, monthly workers that would come and work in the mines. So people were coming in from Lesotho, Swaziland, now Eswatini, and then long-term workers coming from Zimbabwe. And other parts. And for the relationship between Zimbabwe and South Africa, people were often known as Mujubek, in reference to their living in South Africa in Johannesburg. In the 1960s, 70s, 80s, you start to see more female migrants going into South Africa, traders, many of them known for selling doilies, although that was not the only short-term trading that was happening. But these groups interest me in reference to today for a number of reasons, right? The first being that a lot of these people tended to be medium educated, tended to be in the working class, and they were going to South Africa, spending time there, working in the mines, doing their trade, and then returning back home. And so that's what's critical as we think about what has changed. There's always been this long-term relationship, this long engagement of migration between Zimbabwe and South Africa. So what has changed? Crash and others have a study that looks at 3 waves of migration between Zimbabwe and South Africa. And their study looks starting from the 90s, then the period between 2000 and 2005, and then the post-2005 era. And again, slowly, we were starting to see a shift, whereas highly educated migrants had always moved right around the world with an intention to be there for a long time, becoming citizens and whatnot. This is just not what we were seeing with this particular group of migrants, at least between Zimbabwe and South Africa. So what I wanted to take note of is the shift that starts to occur after 2000 to 2005. And most people will know that between 2000 and 2005, it's also the period where the economic decline in Zimbabwe starts to go down really badly. So then you're getting different forms of migrants at the same time. You're getting the nurses, the doctors, the teachers, right? Who quickly become absorbed in the South African employment sectors because there was a need for nurses, teachers, doctors, all of these professionals that were needed because South Africa has now just gained its independence from an apartheid system that made access to education for Black people very difficult. South Africa has also experienced an outward migration of white South Africans who had previously held these positions. So there was this need, this formalized need for Zimbabwean professionals. So they go in and they fill into those sectors, right? And this is the migration that we've often talked about. What happened to Zimbabwean nurses? What happened to Zimbabwean teachers? What happened to Zimbabwean doctors? But at the same time, you're also starting to see people that were not necessarily professionals, people that had been traders, people that had been in the informal sector. And now the difference for those people is that once they go into South Africa now, between 2000, 2008 and onwards, their chances of returning back home become slimmer. So now those people are integrating into the South African system, but in a very different and more complex way than we'd seen before. And they're settling in areas where migrants weren't necessarily settling for long term. So in the 70s and 80s, when you would have Zimbabwean migrants settle into Soweto, for example, it was temporary. So they would settle there, they would do their trading, they would work in the mines, wherever they were, and then they would return home. Because at that point, what they earned in the rands was able to sustain their livelihood in Zimbabwe until the next return. But now you've reached 2000, 2005, the Zimbabwean economy is spiraling. It's just falling, tumbling, right? So even if somebody's to leave and to go back with their rands, that doesn't last as long as it used to. In my own work, I've done a lot of interviews with migrants. And again, bias even in my work, where I've mostly talked to people that went into South Africa, maybe they were documented or undocumented, but they quickly found their way through the educational system to regularize their paperwork, and then we qualify them under the educated migrant sectors. But for today, I really wanted to focus in on understanding. So the tweet that I sent out that Professor Mandaza referred to was when I was asking, when did Zimbabweans become the most hated immigrant group? And perhaps that was more emotional than I intended. But what I was trying to get to is, where do we see this shift, right? From late 90s, 2000s, where people are sort of thinking, well, Zimbabweans are coming in, they have the skills that we need, and we love Zimbabweans. We are friendly with Zimbabweans, et cetera, et cetera. But now there's been this complete shift. And so one of the things we start to pick up on, especially in the post Operation Mrambachina era, is that you're getting younger and younger migrants actually trekking into South Africa from the border towns, trekking into South Africa and then staying in South Africa. So you've got kids as young as 15. So obviously these children don't have any skills with them, right? So they're trekking into South Africa and they're staying in South Africa. The second thing is that now we've got a generation of kids that are also being born in South Africa. So they're foreign-born migrants. They're staying there. And this is not to say that, well, these are the people, this is why, you know, you've seen an increase in crime. We know that research, especially on the US-Mexico case, where people often raise the same issues of, well, why do we see more crime in places where they have migrants? The data has shown us, and already Professor Ibo Mandaza has alluded to it, that increased migration does not in of itself increase crime. It doesn't. But what I want us to pay attention to is what happens when you saturate places, right, with a particular population that's already disadvantaged. And so this is what you start to see in the post-2005 era. Excuse me. So in the post-Mrambachina era, not only are you getting really young people, you're getting people that were working in the informal sector, which means that they're also entering into the informal sector in South Africa. The informal sector in South Africa has never had a shortage of people. So now what we've done is that the Zimbabwean migrants into South Africa are saturating a field that's already saturated, right? So you already had a lot of Black South Africans in the informal sectors. And so now you also have millions of Zimbabweans coming in to join into the informal sectors. Then the other important thing is, where are people going to settle? So we know from our network research, from our social networks studies, of people tend to go to places where they already know somebody, which means that people were tending to saturate in smaller places. So the case study that I was looking at over the weekend was Soweto, and I'm using Soweto broadly here, so you could think of Soweto plus. So now you've got the same group, the same demographic of people going in to saturate into Soweto, where the resources are already marginalized, the people themselves are already marginalized, because the state hasn't quite figured out how to create opportunities for Black South Africans in those locations. And now you've got double, triple, quadruple the same number of people. And the government is still not able to address, well, how do we take people in the informal sector and formalize those jobs? How do we make sure that people in the informal sector are earning enough money to support their families? How do we make sure that people that are living in these low developed places get enough housing for themselves? So when I did my field work, and it's been a few years now, one of the things that fascinated me the most when I went into Khayelitsha, for example, is that people were being very creative. And, you know, these are neighbors that really liked each other, but there was a lot of creativity in how to create extra housing. So extra housing for the Black South Africans that already lived in Khayelitsha, but also extra housing to accommodate the new arrivals. And so what people were doing were to build plastic shelters in their backyard. And these plastic shelters would house 3 to 4 families, right? And so the fault isn't on the people that are living in the plastic shelters, and it's not even on the landlords themselves. The fault was on the fact that the government made promises in 1994 on availing more housing, and that was never done. And then as the situation in Zimbabwe deteriorated, it pushed more people out of Zimbabwe into South Africa, and not just the band of migrants that we're used to, but then all these other people too in the low income band, in the low education band, in the informal sector band. And so those people found themselves, especially in the Khayelitsha sector, found themselves living in Khayelitsha in these plastic homes. And for me, that was really puzzling, because at the same time that I was there, there was a fire that broke out in one of the houses, which razed 50 houses, right? So one fire from one house destroyed about 50 houses. Again, because this was about the way that the houses were compact. And now you have more people living in those areas. And so when people ask, well, why are we seeing a lot of these problems in the same areas? And I think it's because, well, you've taken the problems that were in Zimbabwe, right? You've taken people that were living, whether it was in the peri-urban areas where you already had issues of low employment, low income, and all the challenges that come when you have people living in those under those conditions. And then we've compounded those conditions in low income areas in South Africa, where people are already facing low income, low access challenges. And now you have a triple factor, or what we think of as a multiplier effect of those challenges. And so this has continued on, right? And we kind of see spikes. Every time the situation in Zimbabwe deteriorates further, you see spikes in those same locales where people are like thinking to themselves, well, I'm still going to go to South Africa. I might live in a low income area, but the few runs that I make are better than what I would be making in Zimbabwe. And I also wanted to share some interesting data, which is that we've been talking a lot about global migration, and we find that only 2% of Africans actually emigrate outside the continent. About the majority of African migrants migrate within the continent. And in particular, what we find is that at least 24% of African migrants are going into Southern Africa. And so what that actually means is that 24% of migrants going into Southern Africa are all going into South Africa. And so South Africa itself is a young developing country, right? It's young. At the end of apartheid wasn't too long ago. It's very young. And so now it has this responsibility of absorbing all of these migrants, wonderful people coming from different parts of the continent for many different reasons. Some of them are coming in to join the formal sector, right? Filling in spaces that need to be felt in. Some of them are escaping war and other violence that's happening on the continent. And we know this, right? We know that a lot of the refugees, even the ones that pass through Zimbabwe, they'll stay at the refugee centers in Zimbabwe for a short while, but often the destination in mind for most people is South Africa. So then South Africa is capturing all of that as the home for the continent. And because South Africa is young, because South Africa still has the same challenges of many developing countries, which is that in many developing countries, you're going to see, well, not everybody is making the same amount of money. And when not everybody is making the same amount of money, you're more likely to see crime, even if it's petty crime, but you're more likely to see that. You're more likely to see frustrations within neighborhoods. So what does it mean then if we take all these people and compound those factors in those low income neighborhoods that already exist? And so the reason I started here is because this conversation that's happening, where I think we've taken out South Africans in those neighborhoods that are receiving a lot of the migrants, and we've taken their voices out of the conversation and dismissed them as anti-African, as anti-Black, and we haven't paused to think, well, wait a minute, let's actually think about this. What is happening if the problems in Zimbabwe are causing everybody to run away from home, right? And when everybody has run away from home, it means that we're putting pressure in communities that don't necessarily have the bandwidth to even help the people within their own communities. And now there are all these extra people that need to be helped. And the system is not strong enough yet to sustain all of this. And the good news is that generally when you have more migrants, it can be good for the economy. But the triple factor challenge for South Africa is that unlike the United States, which is much older, has a much bigger economy, South Africa has a smaller economy. it also has its own struggles with unemployment. And so now we've brought in more people that are joining into that economy and need to be provided for by the state. And of course, we know that the South African government, like the Zimbabwean government and many others on the continent, doesn't necessarily have a shortage of money, but sometimes there's a shortage of the decision to allocate resources. So then, I don't know if many of you have watched the documentary Dear Mandela, where the question being asked in that documentary is, wait a minute, how come the elites are building mansions, but the children of Soweto, the children of Khayelitsha are still living in this small, tiny homes? How come that's what's happening? And so that's a challenge that already exists for South Africa, and something that the nation has to deal with, right? The South African nation has to deal with. And so when you already have such problems, and then you have more people coming in a way, it makes sense that people looking from within their communities are going to place blame on the new arrivals, even though those new arrivals have not necessarily created new problems, but that their arrival has just exacerbated things that already existed. I'm going to pause here, partly because my voice is starting to run out, and so we have time for the next speakers.
Yeah, thanks, Chipo. Just while you're drinking your water, just two questions. One, if you could please explain the Murambachina for many of.
Yes. So
and before also it's clear that you have made the point that the influx of young and younger Zimbabweans into an already saturated informal sector in South Africa, or the arenas in which South Africans are most disadvantaged and virtually destitute, as is part of the problem. Can you also say that really the problems, the flashpoints, are precisely those areas in which Zimbabweans are most present in South Africa?
Yeah, so first, Murambachina, this was the cleanup exercise that the government started in 2005, the Zimbabwean government, where they displaced almost 1 million people. And the idea was that most of those people would be moved from urban areas to peri-urban areas or to rural areas, which would, benefit SANU-PF, but we're not talking about SANU-PF today. But in fact, what happened is that a lot of those people that were displaced ended up migrating into South Africa or immigrating into South Africa. And as I've mentioned before, a lot of them were young. They hadn't finished their schooling. So then that increased the number of people in that demographic of migrants. And then would I say that these people have moved into already saturated parts of the South African economy? Yes. And I think that's the heart of the challenge, right? Is that if we're going to be honest.
Last question is really, and we have not, I referred to that in the concept note. We have said very little so far in the discourse, even within the media, about the culpability of the Zimbabwean state for all this. You made reference to Murambachina. I think it was a very poignant point. I'd almost forgotten that was a major turning point, coinciding as it did with the decline of the economy at that time. But you notice the silence of the Zimbabwean state ever since the death of Elvis Nyati. Almost an embarrassing silence for a country and all of us, but in the state in particular, for this mess that is in South Africa, this mess that we have caused in our country, and almost transferred the burden to our neighboring country. What can you say about that? Why is the Zimbabwean state so quiet? I noticed, for example, that the Zimbabwean ambassador to South Africa was refused at a very hostile reception at the wake for Elvis Nyati.
I don't think they're quiet. I think their surrogates are doing the talking for them. There was a tweet from Nick Mangwana, who's a spokesperson for the government. And in the tweet, he said something very problematic. He said that this was just Afrophobia. He said it was about people that are not willing to address white South Africans and instead coming for Black Africans. And so in a way, they're taking their rhetoric from Zimbabwe and using that in South Africa. And dismissing any responsibility on their part, because if they really have to engage with this, then they have to ask themselves, why is it that this has become the dream of every Zimbabwean child to leave the country and go to South Africa? They would have to address that. But we know that in the past, the ZANU-PF government has also had a complex relationship with the diaspora. Started off with, Robert Mugabe would make fun of people that were working in England who were working in care jobs, right? And at the same time, they also like the remittances that are coming. So they cannot say to people in South Africa, come home, because if everybody comes home, then they lose this money that they have been making from remittances. This is something that I've been saying for a long time, that authoritarian governments in particular benefit a lot from remittances. They benefit from people back home getting the equivalent of a paycheck without them having to create jobs. So now if millions of Zimbabweans return back to Zimbabwe, they have a responsibility now to create jobs, to provide social welfare, to provide better medical treatment. Right now, a lot of Zimbabweans will use South Africa as the first stop for medical treatment. This includes people that can pay for medication and people that can't pay for medication. So everybody is heading out to South Africa. If your relative is sick, most families are figuring out that it's better to find money to take them to South Africa than to scramble within our healthcare system. So if the Zimbabwean government were to make a statement, they would have to do a number of things. The first would be to admit that, well, look, you have problems in South Africa because we have exported those problems. And that's just something that our government is not willing to do. The second thing is that they would have to have an action item. So what's the action item? Are you going to encourage your citizens to come back home? I don't think they want to do that. But even if they did that, it would be very disingenuous of them. They would do it in a way of almost attacking the citizens that are abroad. And the third thing is, well, if your citizens come back, do you have the resources for them? How are you going to support them? What's going to happen when you have millions of young unemployed people? What is the thing that becomes their job? So they're well aware that when you have millions, thousands of unemployed young people, it's going to increase petty crime. And we've already seen this happening in Zimbabwe. So they're well aware of that. That's why they're not offering to repatriate their citizens back. That's why they're not even willing to engage with the South African government, because it would mean that they would actually have to go beyond the talking points of Nick Mangwana and others and to make real statements. And to offer real solutions. And we know that, this is just not something that this government is prepared to do. And I make these statements in hoping that in some ways we provoke them to make statements that are meaningful and to take meaningful action.
No, thanks, Chipo. You've done a good job here. I will come back to you later. I hope you have time to drink some water. Dale McKinley is our next speaker. Dale, I think we have a very good intervention from Chipo, and I think she has highlighted sufficiently, in my view, the capability of Zimbabwe itself, all of us, but in Zimbabwean state in particular, in the mess that we have in South Africa. Perhaps now you can come in, Dale, and make your presentation as you proposed, namely to highlight the root causes of xenophobia and Afrophobia in South Africa. Dale McKinley.
Sure, thanks, Ibo. And just before I start, just to give, for those of you who are not familiar with myself, I'm also Zim South African. Gweru is my hometown initially, back in the day. And I have been here in South Africa since just after the release of Nelson Mandela and the unbanning of the ANC in 1990, for the last 32 years. And I come from an activist and intellectual background as well, both political and social activism and intellectual endeavor. So I am speaking on behalf of the Copenhagen Africa Against Xenophobia Coalition. For those of you who are not aware, it's a loose collection of a range of different organizations, communities, NGOs, individual activists, migrant organizations, others who came together after the initial sort of uptick, the latest uptick in xenophobic violence and actions, particularly around this Operation Dudula, which was targeting informal traders, in particular in Alexandria and Soweto more recently. And then there was a feeling that there was going to need to be a more coordinated pushback and voice. And that's where Copenhagen has come from. It's not a formalized coalition in any way. It's simply just different activists and others coming together to try to raise a counter voice and narrative, as well as to push back this rising xenophobic violence and discourse. Of course, for those of you who know, this is the latest in the many different iterations in South Africa of the same. I'm going to speak directly to, and I've done much work on this in the broader context of the political economy of South Africa and its own sort of incubation of xenophobic tendencies, which I think it's fundamentally important if we're going to understand the latest version or any of the previous versions. It's fundamentally important to understand the structural nature of where we're coming from and what the roots of this are. It's not simply conjunctural, and it's not simply something that can be, I take the points, and I think they're important points being made with regards to the Zimbabwean situation, but they're not delinked from the political and economic decisions that have been taken by the ANC in this country and by the South Africans in general since 1994. So let's locate some of those structural historical roots in particular reference. And when post the 1994 South African state was formed, as everybody knows, out of a negotiated settlement, it's important to understand, I think, fundamentally that much like in Zimbabwe, what happened was the ex-national liberation movement, in this case, the ANC, took control of an existing state that was built upon, and a society that had built upon fundamentally dividing people according to identities, in racial identities, ethnic identities, and other kinds, but predominantly racial and ethnic identities, the Bantustan system, the complete apartheid segregation and separation. And so the apartheid space and place, what I call apartheid space and place, has been with us for 30-something years, since now post-1994, 20-something years, and has never really fundamentally been transformed in any meaningful way, outside of maybe some of the middle and upper middle classes and the deracialization of the elite sections and the upper sections of the economy, and in residential neighborhoods where those who can afford have been able to do so. But otherwise, 1994 South Africa looks very similar to 2022 South Africa in terms of apartheid space and place. And this is fundamentally important to understand in the relation to the nature of the xenophobic incubation. What did that basically do? It married, in some ways, a nationalist politics in which the fundamental sort of political legitimacy of the new ANC government had to come from construction of a new national identity. So from the apartheid into the democratic South Africa, and this new national identity, the South African national identity, this rainbow nation, everybody's the same, but the fundamental glue is being a South African. Sorry, there's someone maybe that needs to be muted. I believe there's a bit of quite a background noise there. Can someone mute yourself, please? Thank you. Okay. So that was the one part, was marriage of a nationalist politics and nation building alongside the embracing of economic neoliberalism, of a economic and social system informed by a neoliberal capitalist system that essentially accepted the status quo, the economic status quo. So when you marry these two things, a very narrow nationalism and a national identity politics, which is about loyalty to the new South African state, loyalty to the South African identity. And you marry that with economic neoliberalism and a situation, sorry, I'm sorry, but it's very disruptive. Whoever has got their mic on, please, can you mute yourself? Or the host, can you mute?
Mikael, can you help us, Mikael? Mikael? Sorry about that, Dave.
No, it's okay. Okay, so that's the starting point. So essentially, when the ANC came to power after the 1994 elections, it took political control of an existent state that had been built to secure the dominant interest of this new national bourgeoisie, is what I call it in this case. In this case, the only difference was the state was now in the hands of a movement whose main aim was to secure the interest of a black nationalist bourgeoisie as opposed to a white nationalist bourgeoisie, although they came to quite similar kinds of agreements and backslapping. So this state-centered changing of the nationalist guard, what I call a deracialized national capitalism, was, sorry, there's still somebody here. I think it's Rambisai Marufa. Please, can you mute? It's very disruptive. Thank you. Thank you. So the state changing of the nationalist guard was this marriage of neoliberalism with the nationalist identity. In both theoretical and practical terms, what this demanded was the creation of a dominant discourse of nation building as a means to politically legitimize the role of this new neoliberal policies, as well as the place of those under its leadership. So in other words, what was being consciously constructed was inherently false and exclusive nationalist identity in politics to be secured by political loyalty to a new South African state, which claimed to represent the national will and interest. It's this macro-nationalist paradigm, this macro-nationalist frame married with a neoliberalism that is the fundamental root of xenophobia and particularly Afrophobia, as we'll later talk about in the context of post-apartheid South Africa. So it's within this context that the South African state itself and the ruling party have constructed and fed the idea and practice of xenophobia in general, and Afrophobia in particular. And let's just remind ourselves at its conceptual heart what xenophobia means. It means a fear of the other, with the other mostly being defined by nation state membership, someone coming from a different nation. So here's the ultimate irony, of course, is that the contemporary post-independence practice of xenophobia in South Africa has its roots in colonialism itself, in the nature of colonialism, the boundaries, the apartheid colonialism, the borders, the very essence of the colonial project is in the DNA of xenophobia. And of course, this goes fundamentally against all of the rhetoric about Pan-Africanism and brothers and sisters and solidarity and liberation movement solidarity and all the other kinds of things that are spewed out by the leaders of this country, as well as many others, which are obviously in complete practical contradiction to that. So since 1994, that construction of this roots of xenophobia, the state has been remarkably consistent in its contradictory and I would call hypocritical discursive and practical construction of the xenophobia. At the same time, the state has also presented South Africa as the new and natural leader of the African continent. Remember Thabo Mbeki's African Renaissance, that we're going to build this African. At the same time, of course, doing exactly the opposite practically in order to push that agenda. So what am I talking about in terms of practical examples is the other element is not just internal to South Africa, but is external. The South African state, when it was confronted with political and economic situations in Zimbabwe after the 2000 elections, after the 2005 elections, after 2008, all the different ones in the early 2000s, and the essential implosion of the Zimbabwean economy and the creation of the essential raping of this Zimbabwean economy by ZANU-PF and the elites and cronies in Zimbabwe, what did it do? it kept silent. It created basically silent diplomacy. I'm sorry, it's again a problem.
The technician is taking care of it, Dale. I think it's someone who just doesn't know the doesn't.
Okay.
Michael?
Okay. I'll continue. Sorry, it's just putting me off a bit here in terms of where I am. But so just to pick up in terms of this contradictory discourse in terms of basically contributing South African foreign policy, political and economic foreign policy itself, contributing to the very conditions, political and economic conditions in a Zimbabwe, in a Mozambique, in other surrounding countries, because of its sub-imperial presence in many ways, acting like the United States acts in Latin America, its backyard, not necessarily militarily, but economically, and pushing its weight around. And basically, when authoritarian governments begin to suppress their populations and destroy their economy, they don't say anything. They basically make sure that this is pushed aside, and the politics of solidarity, of Pan-African solidarity, and I say national liberation movement politics, is presented as the fundamental sort of glue that binds us together, when in fact it has no practical content to it at all. So these sub-imperial presences across the sub-Saharan African region have given rise very much. And that's why I'm saying the South African government is not delinked from what has happened in Zimbabwe, from what has happened in many other countries. And this is obviously at the same time that it's created mass migration and political repression and economic desperation. It has been a boon for South African corporate capital at the same time in the region. People have been making the elites have been making lots and lots of capital and money as a result of the misery. So much like economic neoliberalism globally, we have imported that same model, which is the fundamental freedom and movement of capital, the exact opposite for human beings, unless you have money. If you have money, not a problem. You can buy your way into South Africa. You can buy your legality. You can invest in here. You can become a citizen. You can get your permanent residence. You can do whatever you want. If you're poor, well, bad luck. And I think Chipo has talked about the historical trajectory of that, how after particularly 2000, that began to particularly impact fundamentally on poor Zimbabweans and others who are coming into this country, particularly for economic reasons, but also for political reasons. So the results of these roots then have been multi-layered in the last 20, 25 years internally. And there's more that have been put on there in terms of the root causes of this feeding of xenophobia. So the first thing, of course, is the fundamental mismanagement, malgovernance, corruption of the state itself in South Africa. And the two particularly state entities which have been fundamentally responsible are the Department of Home Affairs and the police, South African police services, both of which are inveterately corrupt, generally inveterately incompetent in terms of actually employing the law on an equal basis. And it has been a very easy segue for each of them to basically then target migrants, and particularly illegal migrants, oftentimes undocumented, not as a result of their own conscious acts, but as a result of the venality, the bribery, the incompetence, the complete dysfunction of the Department of Home Affairs, the shutting down of all dissenters, the refugee asylum seekers, the Zimbabwe special permit process. We can go on and on and on about how that has happened. And of course, that has then created and layered on to the situation. And in order to try to cover that, and to cover that incompetence, and to cover that dysfunction, what's the easiest way to do that? They've learned from Donald Trump. They've learned from Marie Le Pen. They've learned from others in Europe and others, which is you blame migrants. You blame the immigrants for that. You go for the easiest, the most fear-mongering, the most, you tap into people's insecurities and economic desperation, and you blame the most vulnerable in your societies, the ones that have very little voice, because it's the easiest target. And that plays well politically with a particular constituency, particularly in the ruling party, which of course, at the same time is completely, and here's the other side, failing fundamentally to deliver the basics to their own population. So what is the story of post-1994 South Africa? Greater inequality since 1994, greater inequality in our country. Even more people out of work than they were 25 years ago. A greater economic desperation. And these are among poor and working class Black South Africans predominantly, right? Not and others, but its own constituency, the traditional constituency of the African National Congress and others, has been abandoned effectively, at least economically and socially, and has been left to the devices of themselves and to the vagaries of the free market, which of course has not served them well at all. So what you have is you have what I call constructed tension, constructed prejudice, constructed competition amongst the poor. And as Chipo was saying, when you have a range of people coming in who themselves are economically desperate, and they locate themselves where? Within the margins of economic margins of society, in this case, South Africa, informal settlements and other places, that constructed recipe just gets even more, should we say, hotter in many cases and deeper and more intense. And this is exactly what has happened. There are structural causes here, structural explanations, not simply as a result, as I said, of conjunctural circumstances, but things that have been consciously planned and consciously pursued that have given rise to this kind of xenophobia. Of course, then you also have the politicians who themselves, not just within the ruling party, but increasingly those that are coming from other smaller opposition parties, who have caught on, as they have in many other countries, that if they want to play to the constituency, the desperate working class of South Africa in this case, and the poor and workers in South Africa, if they want to appeal to them for their political support, one of the easiest and cheapest ways to do that is to go after migrants in this case. And Zimbabweans, who obviously tend to numerically be quite a large number of migrants in South Africa for obvious reasons, become a particular target. And of course, because of where the majority of them are located within these communities that themselves are so desperate and are so fed up with the government. So what you have is you have the feeding of this xenophobia as well that follows election cycles, that follows the political cycles in South Africa. As soon as there are elections, particularly local government, what do you see? You see politicians starting to go after. Gate McKenzie of the Patriotic Alliance is the latest example in the next election, the last local government elections, where this party out of nowhere, run by ex-gangsters, basically got a substantial vote, a decent amount of votes, particularly within the so-called colored community, and playing against all of these nationalist and identitarian politics and people's desperation. You also have the EFF, which flip-flops depending upon where the wind is blowing. The EFF flip-flops according, at some point it wants to pretend that it's Pan-Africanist and it's with the brothers and sisters of the continent, and the other one, you have Julius Malema and his lieutenants running around basically recently to businesses and saying, why are you employing foreign workers, and you must stop this, and so forth and so on. Then you obviously have the others, Operation Dudula, this latest young opportunist, Lux Lamini, who wants to become a politician clearly, and many of these other politicians taking advantage of the situation. So that just pours fuel onto the xenophobic fire. And particularly the Afrophobic nature, which is what we're talking about. Of course, this is, for me, it's much more of a class issue in relation to the intra-xenophobic explanation. Because as I said, if you're wealthy, if you're a wealthy Zimbabwean, not a problem. Not a problem to come into South Africa. If you're a wealthy Namibian, the elites of Southern Africa are all here. They all own big properties, most of them, including most of the ZANU-PF elites, and most of the elites from the DRC, most of them from Namibia, from Angola, and everywhere else. It's the poor. And particularly those that are forced into, and have no choice, into the spaces, those marginal spaces. So, for example, yes, you have targeting of Somalian and Pakistani or Bangladeshi shop owners in South Africa to a certain extent, because that's where they've concentrated some of their economic endeavor. But for the most part, what you have is you have the vast majority of migrants coming in who are poor, who are from other African countries, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, who are on the short end of that stick in particular. And so that becomes a much more African-centered and Afrophobic kind of tendencies, as opposed to a general xenophobia, but the class nature of that is very, very prominent in terms of one's ability to integrate into the society and into the class society that's professionally or otherwise. So you don't find, of course, Operation Dudula going to Sandton and targeting banks where the middle management of the banks is predominantly Zimbabwe. You don't find this happening. You find they go to Alexandria and target informal traders who are Zimbabwean or of other nationalities, but predominantly Zimbabwean. This is the practical reality of how that plays itself out in the context of the South African xenophobic and Afrophobic context. So those are fundamentally some of the historical roots that have given rise to xenophobia, and the more contemporary forms that has taken in relation to the South African political scene and others as well. I also just wanted to mention a couple of other things before I wrap up, which is that there is we talked, and Ibo was talking about this, misperceptions and misinformation. So what has also exacerbated this in South Africa has been, particularly in the last few years, which we didn't have 15, 20 years ago, is the explosion of social media and the social media space, and the ability of anyone, whether you're in an informal settlement or whether you're living in a mansion in Sandton, to have a cell phone and to be on WhatsApp or to be on Instagram or whatever it is, TikTok, and these other kinds of things, and to be able to share and to see videos and postings. And these have been weaponized, as we have seen in the US and as we've seen in Europe and other places. Social media has been weaponized as a tool to advance particular class, racial, political party interests and others. And of course, when the xenophobes have gotten a hold of this, they have used it incredibly well, actually, to just basically pour the fuel even further, because most of the people that they are targeting, generally poor and working class people themselves, do not have the tools necessarily to go and be able to verify facts and to verify all sorts of other kinds of things that are being pushed around. People are just pushing a video. There's many examples just in the last week, I can tell you, where there are hundreds of videos going around, all of which are over 10 years old, all of which have nothing to do with what's been happening in the last 2 or 3 months. But people see them and go, wow, this has happened just yesterday, and the misinformation goes. Or somebody says, there are 16 million illegal immigrants. I was on a debate with the head of Operation Dudula just the other day on SAFM, one of the heads of and she basically said, as a fact, on national radio, there are 16 million illegal immigrants in South Africa. Of course, a complete lie, a complete fabrication, but this gets pushed and then it gets taken up. So the weaponizing of misinformation, of lies, of manipulated statistics and other kinds of things has fueled that, particularly among the poor and the working class themselves, who then it just circulates and then creates this frenzy of misinformation, and people then move in that direction, begin to actually believe and act on what is actually not true at all, and has become a politics of lying and a politics of manipulation, unfortunately. So this is the latest and another element to the construction of this and to the roots of this. Just to end off, I mean, I'm not here to talk about, we can, if we have a little bit of time, maybe, about the things that I think and that we as Kopanang think can be done and should be done to try to push back this very deep-rooted, kind of xenophobic, Afrophobic politics and actions in our country. But just to say that, yes, there are many different components to this, but the one thing that as Kopanang, and we are very, very clear about, and I think any of those who have been here in this country over the last many years fighting, not just around xenophobia, but around basic services, political freedoms and expression, the crushing of dissent, all these other kinds of things that many other people outside the country don't see, that the sinews of the society have been increasingly strained and increasingly conflictual, is that this kind of xenophobia here serves very particular interests, and it serves them very well. And this is why it keeps getting fed. Of course, it's combined with objective realities of people's desperation, inequalities, the constructed nature of that historical nature of those roots I'm talking about, and the combination of these two things, the economics and the politics have come together to create a very toxic brew in this country, which is unfortunately something that is not going to be uprooted anytime soon, just as precisely because those roots go very deep into very, very specific historical, political, economic, social, cultural roots, and are not reducible to a policy issue or to leadership or to a particular political party being in power, but to the nature of South African society. I'll stop there, and thank you very much for the opportunity to share and to engage.
Unmute. Yeah, thanks, Dale. Michael, where are you? Yeah, thanks, Dale. Just one question. What do you understand to be the position of the ANC and the state on this subject? Why, for example, is the Minister of Home Affairs making such strident, if not also self-confident statements on the subject, such as I've quoted at the opening of this conversation?
Well, I think, first of all, that there is and always has been a fundamental difference between what is said by the political leaders of the ANC and what is practiced by the ANC itself as a political party. That would apply to whether it's in this case, in terms of the recent xenophobic violence and others. I would say that that's generally a characteristic of the elites in this country, the political and economic elites. They want to be seen as being progressive, as being humanistic, as being inclusive, as being Pan-African, tolerant, and so forth, because that is a politically good thing in the larger context. But in practice, it's a completely different story. And Cyril Ramaphosa is no different, I would argue, in terms of this. He says a lot of the right things. And it's good that he says those things. He came out and said, Operation Dula should not be doing what it's doing, it's criminal activity and so forth. And we must not forget what the contribution of all of our brothers and sisters in Africa were in the liberation days and in creating the South Africa that we want. All of these are correct things. But when it comes to actually doing the activities that would need to be to address the thing, for example, like taking care of a xenophobic Department of Home Affairs Minister, Aaron Motsoaledi, who you quoted earlier on, he doesn't do anything because he's more concerned, and the ANC has always been more concerned with its own factional politics and its own positionality of its leadership than it has with anything else. So everything that gets filtered through the ruling party, whatever it is, oftentimes gets filtered through its own factional politics and what's good and what's going to play well in terms of who's coming up. The ANC is going to have a Congress soon. So this gets also filtered through that. So I would say that while it's to be encouraged and welcomed that we encourage the more progressive elements of the national liberation movement, whether they're in the ANC or others, to speak out, to be consistent, unfortunately, in the case of the ruling party, their actions often belie the rhetoric. And so it's necessary to go after those root things as opposed to saying that we can rely on a particular organization or particular leadership in order to do that. I just wanted to respond to a comment in the chat function, which I think is a complete misinterpretation of what I was trying to argue. And I apologize if it came across that way. But I see Panache is basically accusing me of class reductionism, of specific anti-Blackness that informs Afrophobia. Not at all. I was simply trying to point out that I think I've properly understood the roots, the historical roots of this Afrophobia within a whole range of different identitarian politics, whether that's racial, whether that's class, whether that's ethnic and otherwise. What I was simply trying to say is that when it comes to one's class status as an immigrant, it matters. That's what I was trying to say. So that it makes a fundamental difference whether you are an elite from Zimbabwe, whether you're an elite from anywhere else, and how you get treated in this country, as opposed to being poor. So that is the nature of it. And that's a reality. It's not any kind of my particular analysis. This is simply a reality. I wanted to respond to that. Thank you.
Thanks. Panache, you can come in later. I will invite you when we begin the discussion. In the meantime, I'm now calling on Eleanor Sisulu. to have the difficult task of speaking after two other speakers. But as usual, I have no doubt you can handle it, Eleanor.
Okay, well, they've made my task easier because I don't have to go too much into the historical causes. I may have some slight differences with Dale in terms of the kind of, I think the ANC is very divided and there's different strands. But I do agree with him that there is a big difference between what he said and what he's practiced. I was glad that Chipo referred to Operation Murambatsvina because I think that's, that really has been ignored as a factor. And that's one of the crimes of humanity that, you know, we talk a lot about Kukurahundi, but we don't talk about this recent crime, which was very, very professionally documented by the UN, the forced removal of over 1 million people. And it's quite shocking that that thing happened and the consequences to the whole region have been grave. And I should point out there's Zimbabwean migration in Botswana, in Namibia, in Swaziland. There are degrees of anti-migrant, anti-Zimbabwean migrant feeling in those countries, but none of them have taken the form of violent attacks as in South Africa. And I think that is something for people, for the scholars to look at. Why is it? I mean, in Botswana, there are legal measures and issues around immigration, issues around becoming citizens, denial of work permits. There's a lot of measures. And when you think of it, those countries have smaller populations. So if you talk about being swamped, they have reason to be worried about being swamped. I mean, more reason than South Africa. So I think the regional migration of Zimbabweans in those countries and the responses in those countries, I think is quite something that should be looked at. The other thing, I think Chipo is spot on in her analysis of young, unskilled Zimbabweans coming into populations that are already stressed, have not themselves seen the benefits of freedom, are still in the shacks that they were in, and don't see themselves as having benefited from the freedom of South Africa. So that is something quite important to note. But I want to talk about more the consequences for South Africa, and I want to also talk about what has been done and who have been the main actors in trying to address these issues. I've put in the chat a very substantive report by the UNHCR documenting their efforts to address this issue of xenophobic violence in South Africa. And I think one can say that the state has always been, the South African state is split, the ANC is split, South African society is divided. Thabo Mbeki once said, oh, South Africans are not xenophobic. And then there's others who will say, oh, South Africans are very xenophobic. And neither is true. South Africa is a society that has strands of deep xenophobic violence, deep xenophobic hatred, and the reasons are outlined. I think Dale has touched on them, Chipo has touched on them, the legacy of apartheid, the legacy of always seeing, being afraid of the other, and that this violence is not only targeted at Zimbabweans, it's also targeted at South Africans, at internal migration. We also have a country which has a history of extreme communal violence in the 1990s, if you recall the black on black violence, and that there was never accountability, there was a political accommodation. So the people that carried out those violence were never made accountable. And I think subsequent cyclical manifestations of xenophobic violence, people have not been held accountable. So there's a culture of impunity, there's a culture of violence. And I think we talk about 2008 and we talk about 2015, but the UN report shows that migrants have been killed, attacked, targeted on a regular basis. So you have these cyclical outbursts when it seems to be extreme, but this has been ongoing. And I want to mention in the run-up to 2010, there were threats, and it's the same pattern, that there's these threats that are upped by social media that went around, that all foreigners must be gone by the time of the World Cup in 2010, in the run-up to the World Cup. And the South African Council of Churches, at our request, that was Crisis in Zimbabwe Coalition and other migrant organizations, got together. SACC convened all these organizations and brought in UNHCR, brought in the representatives of the police, and major attacks were averted. And I would say that the state was responsive at that time, because this was the run-up to the 2010 World Cup, and it would have been, the embarrassment would have been too big to contemplate South Africa on a world stage and these attacks happening in the run-up to such a major event. So, and I regret that we didn't document what we did, and we didn't document the processes we followed to prevent this happening again. But the lessons from that were, one, that you have these buildups, you have the threats, and you have civil society mobilizes, and especially the faith-based community mobilizes to stem the tide and avert the attacks. And then after that, and even organizations are even formed. There was coalition against xenophobia, and we also tried to get the SACC to have a permanent structure dealing with this. But then the crisis is averted, and the violence subsides, and then there's a demobilization. This time, I think the scary thing is that the power of the ANC is threatened. The ANC is facing very serious electoral challenges, more than it has since coming to power in 1994. And sections of the ANCC are responding in a populist way, just as the other political parties are to this issue. It's become an electoral issue, and there's a populist response. And you have a Minister of Home Affairs who I think is just openly Afrophobic, and that combined with what I think what Dale pointed out, social media being weaponized. I think this combination is the perfect storm. And so we are in a very, very scary place. Kopanang Africa has been formed, and I hope that it's an organization or not an organization, because it's not an organization, but it's a network of it's a social justice network, which needs to be supported and which mustn't be demobilized. And we have to find ways of doing this going forward for the protection of people. And, there's the long-term issues which we must look at, but I think the immediate thing of protection of lives, one thing that came out in 2010 was that we need an early warning system. And civil society needs an early warning system. And I hate to say it, but I think civil society needs something along the lines of this Afri forum, a kind of prosecutorial investigative capacity, because the state is not doing this. And somehow that we have to work on the immediate ways to protect lives. The longer term issues can continue to be worked on, but the immediate things, and I think Kopanang and the South African Council of Churches and the faith-based institutions who you know, we didn't do enough to document what was done to prevent further violence and to protect people. And so those things need to be done. The accountability, holding people accountable, because the impunity with which these things are done, and it's just, it's terrifying, I must say. And so there's just a lot of work, and personally for me, I think the political parties are not going to, especially as we go into new election cycles, the political parties are not going to be helpful at all. And I think it's a civil society mobilization. I think it's the strengthening of the social justice movements. I think it's the building of Pan-African solidarity, especially among young South Africans. And I've thought very much about this because our generation has that exposure. And talk about Southern Africans, our generation in the liberation movement had exposure to the rest of Africa. And young South Africans haven't had this. And for South Africa, there has to be a program for South Africa to be part of the continent, to see itself as part of the continent. And I really miss you, Masekela, on this one, because he was really committed to this project and prepared to work and hold concerts and mobilize resources because he saw the dangers to South African society. And the consequences, we saw the last 2015, when there was for the first time a very strong reaction from the continent, where even Madagascar refused to play soccer against South Africa. And I think these are the pressure points that we should, as activists mobilizing, work on. You know, in that was a seismic shock, that you know, the attacks against poor, vulnerable migrants who have no rights, whose countries are not seen as protecting them. But when the continent responded, the South African government had to take notice of this. And I think there has to be continental addressing of this matter. Sadly, our institutions, I can't even have polite words to say about SADC, because SADC has actually played
Mikael, can you help there? Can you help?
It's not on my side.
Eleanor, you are muted. Eleanor.
No, she's frozen. Eleanor. She's not.
You're frozen.
She must have lost power.
I think Eleanor has lost power. We'll get her back after the. We'll get it back later. In the meantime, let me invite comments. Let me invite comments. Panashe, you want to come in now? Please put up your hands, those who want to make a contribution. We have half an hour of discussion. Panashe, and anybody else? We have something to say.
Just hold on. So I'm just looking for my camera. Hold on for me.
Can you identify yourself, Panashe? Where are you from?
Yes, I will just. Sure, I'll do that now.
In the meantime, we can hear you.
Can you see me? Okay, cool.
Yes.
Hi, everyone. My name is Panashe Chugmadzi. I am a Zimbabwean who was born in Zimbabwe, but grew up in South Africa. I'm very much, identified with what Chipo has stated with regards to, those waves of migration. I've seen that over my lifetime as a Zimbabwean South African, and specifically, coming into South Africa with a very classed position, coming in 1991. And I always think the very seminal moment that we come in as the daughter of, a doctor and an accountant, at a moment where, we have ISAP and that kind of what Chipo was speaking about, the absorption of professionals into a transitioning South Africa. And specifically the moment that we come to South Africa, and particularly Durban, is the moment is the moment.
You're muted. Vanessa, you're muted.
Yes, somebody was muting me as I was speaking. But just to say that my introduction to South Africa is very much in the belly of that anti-Black violence. And what is quite interesting over that period is then seeing that, the first time I began to hear the word Ligwere was once we moved to Polokwane, and this was in the era of the land reform, first of all, before even Muramba Trina. In the immediate aftermath of land reform, we began to see, with my family now living in Polokwane and now Beitbridge Beach becoming the most busy border post across Africa, that's when we began to see sort of the influx of the so-called border jumpers. So of course, I'm very much aware that there is a class difference between those of us who might be classed as expats, who were the professionals who could be absorbed into the South African economy, versus those who were the so-called illegal migrants, or rather the border jumpers. And that's the period where even as a young person, I began to be very aware that there's something wrong with specifically being Zimbabwean at that particular moment, where being Zimbabwean was the laughingstock of Southern Africa at that time. And so, of course, there's a huge difference. The kind of physical security that I have as a Zimbabwean of middle-class status in South Africa is very different than the gardener, the hairdresser, the many people that we have in our community. It's very, very different. One of the things I really think it's quite important, what Ma'am Eleanor had mentioned, is the question of why the violence. First of all, to state that what is interesting in living in Southern Africa and going across the history, that South Africa is not exceptional in its anti-Black rhetoric or its anti-African rhetoric. We all know growing up, or we all know from our histories, because people will talk about Mabrantaya, Manyasara, and that kind of thing, that particular kind of antipathy to other African migrants who've been brought in by the settler colonial economy is very much part and parcel of all of our histories. But the question of specifically why the kind of nature of anti-Black violence that we see in South Africa is something that we really need to pay attention to, and thinking specifically about what kind of violence inures and saturates South African society, such that this anti-Black violence that we call xenophobia or we call Afrophobia needs to be understood or linked to a broader spectrum of violence that we see in South Africa. And I think that's a really important dimension. This is not this is not to make abstractions about people's day-to-day. I think what Ma'am Eleanor is saying, that is we need very much to focus on the kinds of things that are going to respond to the fact that people's lives are being threatened today. At the same time, we also have to have a long-term perspective of what are the roots of this anti-Black violence and how we're going to attack it, because we're going to keep on going into the cycle for the next 30 years. I'll leave my comment here, but I think it's quite important to speak to the specific nature of anti-Black violence in South Africa and how that then inures within the question of Afrophobia. Yeah, I'm going to leave it for now because I wish to have a dialogue.
Thanks, Vanessa. Thanks very much for your intervention. Eleanor, if you want to come back.
Man, shut your bitch ass up.
In the meantime, I would, we have someone from the Economic Commission of Africa, ECA, Carolina Medina. When you're ready to speak, you're most welcome. I'm glad you came in from the very beginning. It'd be nice to hear from the continental bodies such as EC on the subject. I have a number of names there. There's Jana, Ngube, John Larson, and Tafazo Choto, in that order. Jana. Jana.
Thanks, Ibo. Thanks, everybody. Thanks to the panel. Big shout out to Sis Eleanor, who I owe a lot of things. I think for me, two key things to contribute to the conversation. Number one, I think the world had a massive shock, particularly I think in the 2008 expression of the Afrophobia that I think is being spoken about. And I remember the Mozambican man who was burnt alive being in the headlines of newspapers all over the world, literally all over the world. And when you think about what has just happened to Alex, the Zimbabwean man who got burnt in the recent spate of violence, and it's like you actually have to look for the news that speak about that particular experience. And my question being, what has happened to our conscience around the world, is Africa, is Southern Africa, is it the issue of that, because this is now a recurring issue, it's lost its media sexiness? Is it, are we being drowned out by what's going on in Ukraine? But it's really bothered me about our conscience as a people, that such a horrific incident of violence happens so publicly. And when you contrast a similar incident in 2008, and you see a really completely different reaction. And then the second thing I want to also speak into, I think something that Dale and Sis Eleanor might have touched into as well, is I think an issue also around the psyche and the experience of violence within the South African community. Because there was a talk around why is it, I think it was Sis Eleanor talking about, when you look at other countries, Botswana, Namibia, where there is similar lack of love, let me put it, for the Zimbabwean economic migrants. And then you don't see an expression of violence in the way that we see it in South Africa. But actually, when we look at South Africa as a community and understand the levels of violence within that country, sadly, it's then not surprising to see that violence, which is many times exerted amongst themselves, now being exerted against the other, as Dale put it. And that's something I think that continuously needs to be worked on, challenged to the South African state to have to really deal with the levels of violence we see in South Africa, even amongst South Africans. And this is what we see, the spillover for me, for what we see happening towards Zimbabwean immigrants. And then the last thing I really just want to appreciate in Chipo's intervention, and I think in your own questioning, Ibo, was really not taking away the responsibility of the Zimbabwean state towards fixing its own issues that affect its populations. Because at the end of the day, when you look at the genesis of a migrant workers in Zim, for me, it didn't happen in the 2000s, coming from the Bulawayo Matabeleland part of the country, where there always was a sense that that part of the world is not integrated into the Zimbabwean economy. We always knew that our big brothers, particularly brothers, and our mothers, sisters, when they just hit 18 or finished school, they were border jumpers and were going to South Africa because that's where they felt the opportunities for them were more available compared to Zim. I think what then happened after 2000 into the Operation Rabatwinas, it then just opened up the whole country to perceive South Africa and other places as an alternative. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jana. Now, Tafadzwa.
Let me unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Unfortunately, sorry, I won't put in the video. My internet is a bit unstable. My name is Tafadzwa Choto from the International Socialist Organization of Zimbabwe, currently based in Zimbabwe, and I've also been active with Kopanang. What happened with Elvis was very, shocking and scary, frightening as a Zimbabwean in South Africa. And I also felt that it would give us more, the opportunity to interrogate other factors. And I can say I was equally disappointed with some Zimbabweans saying that should happen so that Zimbabweans can go back to Zim and register to vote and then vote next year. I just want to highlight that when my daughter was here in January, she asked me, why is there Pick and Pay here? Why is there Lancet? She wanted to know. Those are some of the things that we are not interrogating, that for business, there are no borders. They can invest wherever they want. As Dale said, we've got the elite Zimbabweans living here, living large. And now because the South African government have failed to make its promises, to deliver its promises, it's turning a blind eye, putting the blame on immigrants. Yet the blame is not there. The South African system is very violent because of the gap between the rich and the poor. That is there. That's why you see that apartheid system was very violent. It has been continued with the current government. And to make matters worse, the South African economy it's a sub-imperialist country. It's like a mini America that has taken business from others. Those are the things that we are not raising. And I was disappointed that the left in Zimbabwe did not attack, but instead said the attacks should take place so that the Zimbabweans can come back and vote. We should now interrogate the class question, the inequality that has been caused by the capitalistic crisis. That is the root cause of all South Africa and also in Zimbabwe. Thanks, Ibo.
Thanks, Tafazwa. Do you think that there should be a kind of response? Do you think there should be a response from the continent, including the AU and the Economic Commission for Africa? It appears to be a reluctance to confront the issues. And Eleanor made the point about SADC. SADC should have taken the lead, but there's nothing of the sort. I think there's need to remind South Africa at the regional and continental level of the interdependence between itself and the rest of the continent. You mentioned the bond marchés and the Pick and Pays. I think the sooner the South African public knows that South Africa depends very heavily on economic relations with the rest of the region and the continent, I think that would change, would help to impact on the kind of negative attitude towards so-called foreign Africans. Carolina, are you able to come in? Carolina? But I saw Munjozi. Munjozi, you want to come in the meantime? Mutandiri. Munjozi. Munjozi. Anybody want to come in? Munjozi.
Hi, Doc.
Hi there.
Sorry. Hi, how are you? I was struggling with technology. So I think that this is an important discussion, and obviously I want to acknowledge the inputs that came from the panelists. I think quite important. Two things that come from me. The first one is that I think personally we are witnessing a sad, tragic failure of leadership on the part of the ANC. I mean, right from the presidents to the refusal to just take leadership, because first and foremost, the anti-foreign sentiment, the anti-African sentiments has gathered momentum through social media and all these other platforms that I've created, and a few organizations like Dudula and Put South Africa First. But in many communities, a lot of South Africans have always welcomed Africans, and they are living with them side by side. We have a few communities where we have seen even communities resisting Operation Dudula itself because it does not speak for the majority, even though it appears they have won the narrative on social media. But what I hoped to see was clarity from leadership, not to appear to be using this for politicking, for electioneering. You get a sense that there is a reluctance from the ANC that we can't stand on a principled position on the basis that it might be what is popular and it might cost us an election. And I was wondering that I saw, I think yesterday or so, they lost a award in the Northern Cape to the EFF. And so I'm just trying to say with regard to the positions that the leadership is taking on issues of principle that we expect more leadership. The second point, Doc, that is worrying to me is the level of impunity and corruption that is being promoted. Impunity in the sense that perpetrators are not brought to book at all. The people that do this kind of things, that organize, even that have meetings to instigate on xenophobia and stuff, most of the time, I have worked on this issue for a long time. And I know that in most cases, the people who start the meetings, who organize, are known, the planning meetings are known, and I am sure the intelligence of this country would be aware of these things, but nothing happens to the perpetrators by and large. But also the level of corruption that we are starting to witness from the police. Even when where Minister Motsoaledi will be at the border between Messina and Beitbridge, and he says he has a roadblock with the Home Affairs, with the police, and all these things. In most cases, individuals are being made to pay 3,000 rands or so to be able to be let go. And police now are hunting Zimbabweans in these high-density suburbs, in Yeovil, in Hillbrow. A police van will just be hunting for foreigners for the purposes of getting bribes. And we see little action around these things. In terms of the way forward, in my opinion, I think that people that are working on these things, we saw what CAX is trying to do, which is commendable. And I think that we have to work more with communities on the ground, try to romp in churches and community leaders and isolate the perpetrators and this kind of people that are organizing around this. I think that it's an important aspect of what needs to be done. But also issues for Zimbabwe, it's said, because the Zimbabwean government is completely absent. Besides the statements you see, there is no effort to protect citizens. I had a discussion with a few people at the consulate and a few people at the embassy to try to say, what exactly are you doing when you keep quiet and all these things are happening? But also back home, a government that knows it has millions or hundreds of thousands of people that are outside Zimbabwe. Why would a government not want to protect its citizens? And so you just think that the level of elite collusion in terms of not caring about the plight of those that are suffering, the plight of the poor, is really worrying. And at organizational levels, people like the ANC and those that fought the liberation struggle, you just look at the lack of conscience and that we are witnessing and think that there is a fall from grace that is so sad disheartening. But I think that we need to work with communities, mobilize young people to really take a stance. Organizations like SASCO and the other youth formations, I think, need to speak up. And behind the scenes, these are things that we need to hammer on and ensure that we get a grip on what's developing. Thank you.
Thanks, Mnjozi. Thanks very much. Before I turn to the panelists, again, I'm inviting Carolina if she's able to. But I saw Carolina, please come in, and then Brian Kauma. Brian, after Carolina, I'll ask Brian Kauma. I noticed you wanted to speak, and then I'll go back to the panelists, beginning with Eleanor. Carolina, welcome. Please introduce yourself, Carolina.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you very much for the invitation and greetings from New York. I am Carolina Medina, and I am here on behalf of the UN Secretariat. Thank you very much for the invitation, Professor Mendaza. And it was extremely interesting and enlightening hearing the panel elaborate on the origins and consequences of hate speech. And indeed, hate speech is on the rise worldwide, with the potential to incite violence and undermine social cohesion and tolerance caused by psychological and emotional and physical harm based on xenophobia, racism, anti-Semitism, and other forms of intolerance and discrimination. So in this context, education, we believe, can play a fundamental role to address hatred, both online and offline, and help to counter the emergence of group-targeted violence, of course, rooted in structural issues the panel mentioned. So this is something that the UN has under its radar, and we are trying to tackle it through the Sustainable Development Goals, through the Education 2030 Agenda, a number of campaigns and advocacy initiatives. Eleanor mentioned the work of UNHCR in this work stream. So we just came here with the willingness to listen and to hear from you, the experts, about your specific and local and regional experiences and knowledge. So just thank you for the opportunity and for this very, very timely conversation. Back to you.
Please don't unmute me at all during the discussion. Thanks a lot. I think Brian Kauma has changed his mind. So I will now go to the panelists, beginning with Eleanor, Dale, and last but not least, Chipo. And Eleanor, please.
Okay. Yeah, sorry. Yeah, the tyranny of ESCOM.
Yes, I was gone, huh?
Yes. Okay. So I just want to talk about a couple of mobilizing things. One, I was talking about South Africans who had the special permits, who are now in the process of having their documents removed, the permits taken away, and they are having, and these are skilled Zimbabweans, a lot of them self-employed, lawyers, accountants, etc. And their bank accounts are being closed. And some are planning to return home. So I was talking to one of them who is returning home, who had been planning to go home anyway. And the Zimbabwe government is imposing a tax, I think, he has to pay 14% of the value of his goods that he's bringing. Now, if you imagine bringing a vehicle home and you have to pay 14%, you are already forced to leave South Africa because your permit is being taken away. So you're being squeezed out. And at the same time, it's been made unaffordable for you to go home. So I think just as one point of activism, Zimbabweans should be active about this and say Zimbabweans coming home should not have any taxes imposed upon them. They have already been paying remittances. The government has benefited from the remittances. There's no earthly reason why they should be taxed coming home. So that's one thing. Second thing is that I just think in South Africa, the support for organizations, for Kopanang, the initiative, that it remains, it doesn't demobilize when tensions subside. It needs to be built as a strong network, and that we should support it. And that we should support a program that enables young South Africans to have exposures, young progressive South Africans, especially from poor communities. I remember being sent by my relative Ibo Mandaza when I was working for the Ministry of Labor in Zimbabwe, against my will to Senegal, as with other young Zimbabweans that were sent to Senegal and I think Ghana and Nigeria. And it was a truly transformative experience for me. And it enabled me to see the settler state and spatial apartheid of Southern Africa in a totally different light. And I can say gave me a Pan-African identity. And that's an experience I would really like for young South Africans. South Africans know, I mean, the knowledge of the rest of Africa, the lack of knowledge is absolutely shocking. And this is something, you know, we can talk about anti-xenophobia programs, but I think we also should talk about a Pan-African project, and a Pan-African project that is also linked to employment for young South Africans. I mean, people worked in the anti-apartheid movement over many, in many countries. You know, people talk about put South Africa first, and I think that's a history, the counter-narrative that we should be creating or impressing, that the world puts South Africa first, Africa puts South Africa first. So it's extraordinary for South Africans to be even talking about put South Africa first in this chauvinistic, exclusionary manner. So there's a whole counter-narrative project that we have to work on. But the immediate thing, I think, is really to support networks which can work on a continuous and ongoing basis to address this. I think for Zimbabweans also, this issue of Operation Murambatsvina and what happened to people, it has just been dropped. It's like it didn't happen. And I think, you know, that needs, the region needs to be reminded, the country needs to be reminded. If you recall, there was a report done by Anna Tibaijuka, the Tanzanian, at the time, head of UN Habitat. And that report was just completely ignored. And I think we should resuscitate this because it's about the human rights of people. Yes, we can talk in the long term about, and we can have our political critiques, and we can criticize and look at the long-term measures. But I think really the human rights of people in the short term right now, we need to work on some of these programs. Thank you.
Thanks, Eleno. Thanking you later. Dale, are you still there?
Yes, I am, Ivo.
Your last words on the subject for today, at least.
Sure. So much to talk about. I wanted to just pick up a couple of things. I think it's in relation to the more sort of organizational, mobilizational counter voice and counter movements, because I have personally, like Eleanor, been involved for the last 20 years, ever since the first sort of xenophobic activities and violence started surfacing in South Africa, in trying to respond to these in very different organizational ways. And I agree that, you know, a lot of it has been fairly reaction oriented in terms of the particular upsurge in incidents, and then it dies off when things move away. And I think that the one thing that needs to reflect for those of us who are here in this country is the general weakness of South African progressive civil society itself. The unions in this country are in crisis, generally speaking, and the general nature of community organizations, social movements that used to exist is also a shadow of its former self. So there's a lot of work that needs to be done in South Africa itself amongst progressive activists, amongst movements, particularly the churches. Just let me give you a very disappointing example recently when Kopanang marched here in Johannesburg after against Dudula and against this. And we approached the South African Council of Churches and we asked them to send some of their leaders to front the march. We were afraid that Operation Dudula was going to create some violent incidences. We wanted to have as many people there as possible from as many different constituencies. And the official response of the South African Council of Churches was, sorry, we can't participate in your march. We don't want to take too much of a public stand at the moment on this. I was taken aback. Nonetheless, the larger point being that I think those of us here in South Africa have a lot of work to do to maintain and create a much more permanent voice, and would plead to others. And many in Kopanang, there are many Zimbabweans, many people from other African countries, and some obviously from internationally. And it's a truly internationalist collective. So we are here, we're trying our best, but with very limited human and financial resources, but we'll be doing that. And the other thing is to say on the positive side, and it's picking up from a couple of the other comments about that we do not believe fundamentally that the majority of South Africans are xenophobic, that harbor these things. And in fact, there are many different examples of communities that have gone in the other direction. The classic example in Johannesburg being Thembelihle, which is just to the south of Soweto, where they have managed in many different ways to come together. So our approach here is a counter voice and a counter movement, education, direct action, constant pressure on our own government, and a struggle to implement the basics here. It's a wide-ranging struggle, and to say that we're up against the issue of violence and the trauma in the society is so deep. The availability of weapons in South Africa is incredible. I can walk down my street here in my community close to the CBD, and I can pick up an AK-47 for 1,000 rand, not a problem. Just right here. So we have a lot of work to do in terms of addressing some of the very deep-seated, as I mentioned, structural and social problems. We're doing it as best we can, and I think we ask all of those who are both inside and outside Africa to join us in that struggle. Thank you.
Thanks, Dale. Thanks a lot. Chipo, do you still have a voice? Chipo. Chipo. Have we lost Chipo? Chipo. Chipo. She's still there.
Hi, sorry, I was having some tech issues. What was the question?
It's your last words on the subject. We are winding up.
Oh, yeah.
You're the last speaker, and just to reiterate your input. I forgot to ask the other panelists if there are any chats which require addressing. Please go ahead and do that.
I think one of the things that everybody has mentioned so far that I hadn't talked about is the psychology of violence in South Africa. And I want to be careful that the implication here isn't that South Africans are more violent, but is that this is a society that lived through a very violent form of colonialism for a very long time. I think unlike our settler colony, where in some ways the violence, when it did occur, was removed from neighborhoods, apartheid was this constant violence on people. And I was thinking of something my mother said. My mother, who was a trader in South Africa starting from the 70s through the 80s. And she would comment on the constant harassment of people that she noticed in South Africa through the authorities that was very different from what was happening in Zimbabwe. And even though, according to official terms, South Africa never experienced a civil war, it's a country that's experienced constant civil unrest. And so I think that shapes the way that people interact with each other, particularly the way that poor people or people that are excluded from the economic sectors respond to each other. I also wanted to say, I think there's a role for the middle class, the Zimbabwean middle class and the South African middle class, where they have been outside of these conversations and only making comments here and there. But I think if the Zimbabwean middle class, the many Zimbabwean professionals that are working in South Africa, if they were to once in a while share their voices about the politics, about what's happening, maybe that would do a lot to change the conversation, the way that people feel about each other. And I'll give a specific example. I thought a lot about this when Dr. Cindy Van Zyl passed away. There were so many wonderful comments and outpouring of love from both South Africans and Zimbabweans on the person that she was, on her kindness, her willingness to assist people every day. And so what occurred to me is, look, here's a Zimbabwean, and she has, the heritage of both countries. And so if people can see her humanity, how do we translate that into the way that we see the humanity of each other in our neighborhoods? And so I think the middle class has a role to play here. The middle class often says that, oh, we are beyond politics. I've also been asking my middle class friends in South Africa what they think about, these events, especially after the unfortunate passing of Mr. Nyati. And most of their responses are, oh, but this is not going to happen to us. And I think this is precisely why things keep happening in poor neighborhoods, because those people that are living in Sandton, in Fourways, in Beachview, in Tableview, in all of these nicer places keep saying, well, that's not our problem. Well, if you're a Black person living in South Africa who understands the history of that country, how is this not your problem? How is it not your problem that people are living in squalor when the majority, when a small minority has so much land? How is this not your problem? So I guess I want to end there and say, instead of us thinking about this as South Africans have a problem issue, I think we have to think about it as these are the challenges that Black people are facing, rooted in colonialism, rooted in apartheid, and finding strength in failed governments, in failed post-independence governments. And how do we as a people, particularly the middle class, how do we contribute positively to a conversation? How do we push for more equity? Because if there's no equity, if there's no redistribution of wealth, if people are still living in poverty, then guess what? More people are going to get burned. More people, because people's anger, I think someone said on Twitter that, look, when people's electricity goes, they're going to take out their anger on someone they think stole a copper wire, and that's their neighbor. So for as long as people are living in squalor, and so for as long as Black people in South Africa are suffering, you're going to continue to see this violence, right? Because anger will manifest itself in violence. And for the Zimbabweans on here, you know that our country is not safe from the violence as well. We're starting to see bubbles of violence entering middle-class Zimbabweans. You've got people getting hijacked all the time. It's not because people are naturally bad people, it's because there's poverty, there's bad governance, and there's the middle class that consistently chooses to say, that's not our problem and we don't do politics. So those are my parting words. Thank you, Professor Ibo, for this. And I'm sorry that I've been in and out just because my throat is really burning.
Well, thanks. Thank you formally at the end of the thing. I just want to, before I close the session, just to say that there have been some interesting interactions behind the scenes, one of which is from my brother and comrade Paulo Jordan. Some of you will know him, and a scholar, but also ex-combatant of the South African struggle. He says, I quote, "These are the dangerous situations that SADC organs should be addressing. Our trade unions ought to have taken this up years ago. Thus far, it seems it is South Africans who are at fault. I'm forwarding this to Blade Nzimande, another brother of mine, and the COSATU General Secretary." So there is some concern there. Let's not just think that as Eleanor says, the ANC is divided, but generally those who have been in exile acutely embarrassed at what is happening. I just want to highlight the points made. One is Chipo's reminding us of the Mrambo China 2005, and Eleanor has made reference to Tibayuka report. Tibayuka, incidentally, was one of my students in Dar es Salaam. That report has been forgotten, and I think we should raise it from the shelf and make it a point of discussion next time round. I was concerned, and particularly concerned, about Eleanor's reference to the returning Zimbabweans in text. This is really insensitive of this government in Zimbabwe. To add salt to the wounds, so to speak. I was in South Africa 2 weeks ago, and I was pleased to meet the middle classes that Chipo refers to, cross-section of them. They are very concerned about what's happening, and they're preparing a document to submit to the South African government on how to begin addressing the problem of Zimbabweans in South Africa. And we, let's say, we Surface Trust, and in conjunction with the HSRC and also the Wits School of Government, where I'm a visiting professor, we are commissioning a study on the structure and content of the Zimbabwean diaspora, not only with respect to bringing more information such as other scholars have done, like those I've referred to, that have written and sought to inform the public about the reality of the migrants' situation in South Africa, but also with respect to addressing our own problem in Zimbabwe, where we have 70 to 75% of all skilled and professional Zimbabweans outside the country. It's a serious matter. While it is true that we have contributed immensely as Zimbabweans to neighboring countries, especially in the health and education sector, at the same time, when you have 70 to 75% of your most professional and able and skilled people outside the country, it's a major dent on any efforts towards development in a country. The point has been made about the role of civil society, and we thank Eleanor and Dale for the work they're doing in this regard for 20 years or more. And of course, the role of regional, we have to keep prodding and pressurizing SADC to wake up, the AU and global organizations. And I have to thank Carolina for joining us and making the comments that she made. But above all, I want to thank our three panelists. Chipo, you're most prepared for this. And indeed, Dale, we didn't know you until today. And your term weaponizing of misinformation rings in my mind forever. And Eleanor, as usual, passionate and no doubt engaged with this problem. Thank you very much. Until we meet next time, and thanks to all of those who joined us. My brother David Johnson from the Caribbean, Mukadenge, Michael Mambo in Malawi, Owen Sichoni in Zambia, Patricia McFadden in Swaziland, Eswatini, sorry. I must be careful about the terms I use. Some countries have become independent recently. Thank you, and goodbye. Thank you.